So in the talk, I'll combine a few things that I've been working on for quite some time now. So I wrote my PhD thesis a while ago on freedom, and I've since been working a lot on a philosophy of time, and I thought this is a good time to try to tie these two things together and see where this takes us. What I will argue for is that determinism alone is not the sole deciding factor to decide whether agents could possibly have the power to do otherwise, but that instead temporal ontology and the nature of laws are more fundamental for that question. And views on time, so views on free will, if you know the debate a bit, they're usually categorized along the question whether they are compatible with determinism. That's where the names incompatibilism and compatibilism come from. And the reason for that is that determinism is taken to exclude the possibility of real alternative future courses of events. What I'm going to argue for is that in fact, if you take different temporal ontologies and different views of laws, determinism does not turn out to be sufficient or necessary for the absence of real alternatives. So I argue for the case that we should not delineate our views on freedom along whether they are in fact consistent with determinism alone. So, for example, what I'm going to show later is that in some views on time, for example, a Humean view of laws, combined with, for example, a Humean view of laws, the future could be open even if determinism is true. So determinism in that sort of view would not rule out the existence of real alternatives. And then at the end, because all of that is just, or mostly, conceptual work, and that might be a bit boring. So at the end, I will try to give like a very brief outline of what I think about freedom and what an account of freedom could look like in such a Humean world. I'm going to set up the talk like this. I'm just very briefly at the beginning, just basically mention a few views on freedom and some views on time. To get the basics straight, then I'll very briefly talk about what I take determinism to mean, and then we'll go on to see how freedom and the open future relate. And then at the end, I'll present my own, very briefly present my own view on freedom. So let's start with classic incompatibilism, and classic incompatibilism is basically based on the idea that freedom in some way requires the power to do otherwise. So at the time of a decision, there need to be at least two real alternatives that the agent could bring about, and the agent could bring about either of them. Let's define alternative like this after Nico Strobach's definition of the term. So we take two possible developments of the world H and H star, and they are a real alternative at a particular time t, if and only if H and H star have an identical content until t, and of course, if they want to be alternatives, a different content after t. And the idea now is that traditionally these real alternatives are taken to be incompatible with determinism. And then obviously there are libertarian views, which are just incompatibilist views that hold that it is possible to be free because determinism is false and other conditions are satisfied. And again, they feature this notion of the power to do otherwise, intelligibility, and also classically a sort of robust notion of authorship or control. Power to do otherwise, like I said earlier, is the idea that at the time of a decision there are at least two real alternatives present to the agent, and the agent is able to bring either of them about. Intelligibility is the idea that free actions need to be caused or at least endorsed by reasons. And then you have ultimate control. The agent must be the ultimate creator of the proximal causes of their actions. So in a sense, the reasons to act must, in some robust sense, be up to the agent, right? The idea is that not only could the agent have chosen otherwise, but they need to have the ability to set their own reasons to act. And just as a side note, obviously, this is notoriously hard to make compatible, not just with determinism, but also with indeterminism, this last notion, the of ultimate control. There's the famous luck argument that says that if it is basically up to a chance event, like a physical chance event in the brain, what you end up doing, then that doesn't, or what sort of reasons win out, that undermines your control over the action. But I'm not going to discuss any of those classical debates in freedom today. Just as a contrast for this, as a foil, you have classical compatibilism, and that usually does not require the notion to do otherwise if we ignore conditional analyses for now. And in order to be free, the agent just needs to endorse their actions, or the actions need to be caused in the right way by the agent's reasons or desires or preferences. And that's proximal control. But the agent does not need to be the ultimate author of their own reasons or desires, for example. And this is compatible with there not being any real alternatives in the sense that we introduced them above, and hence this is why it's usually taken to be consistent with determinism. So just to repeat where we're standing right now, is that the different views on freedom are usually demarcated along whether they're consistent with determinism. I think that determinism is not the only factor to decide whether there are alternative possibilities. And I will now go on to argue that certain temporal ontologies, for example, trivially imply a lack of alternatives, whereas in other views on time, combined with, for example, Humean ontology, determinism and the existence of real alternatives are consistent. And then I will go on to give my brief account of freedom in a Humean world. So let's continue for a bit with the boring definitions, and let's briefly go over the most prominent strands in temporal ontology, so we know where we're standing. And probably the most prominent temporal ontology, prominent because it's correct, I would say, is Eternalism. And that comes in two forms, either static or dynamic. Static is the more common view. And the idea is that the past, present, and future facts are all equally real, right? So you listening to this talk is as real as the sinking of the Titanic and the end of Boris Johnson's tenure as PM, should he resign in shame or fails to be re-elected. And none of these events are ontologically special, right? There's nothing ontologically that sets these events apart. There's no objective or progressing present, no temporal flow, right? No passage. And the events in this block of past, present, and future events are at best earlier, later related, but there is no objective past, present, or future because there is no objective present. So future, or from our standpoint, later facts like Boris Johnson's resignation are as timelessly the case as this time is, right? So the future in that sense is ontologically settled because all the future events are timelessly the case. Then there's dynamic eternalism, which is called the moving spotlight view. I'm ignoring Ross Cameron's very special view for now, which is slightly different than the classical moving spotlight view. So in the moving spotlight view, again, because it is an eternalist view, past, present, and future facts are all equally real. And so again, like in eternalism, in static eternalism, the sinking of the Titanic is an event that is located in the universal block, as is you listening to the talk or the end of Boris Johnson's tenure as PM. So that's identical, but now there is a progressing and objective present. So present facts have the special temporal quality of nowness and present and non-present fact thus have different qualities, right? So this quality of nowness just lights up in the subsequent present times, like a spotlight that moves over a theater stage. That's where it gets its its name from. But again, the same as in static eternalism, because the future facts are timelessly the case, just as this time is, and the events that happen there and the facts that are located at these times are timelessly the case, just as the event that I'm giving this talk now. The future is again ontologically settled in the same way that it is in static eternalism. Then there's presentism. Presentism is the view that only the present facts are real. So you listening to this talk is ontologically special. Ontologically special because that and all the other events that happen right now are the only events that are actually real. And again, there is an objective and progressing present. And the past facts like the existence of dinosaurs or the sinking of the Titanic are not real anymore, and future facts aren't real yet. So there is no fact in any sort of eternal block of facts in which the Titanic sinks or in which Boris Johnson resigns. Although that means that there are no existing future facts, we'll have to discuss below whether that actually means that the future is open or not, because that is important to to the question of whether there are real alternatives or not. And then there's the growing block view, something that has become a bit more prominent over the last couple of years, although it's usually lampooned as the worst of both worlds. That is a mix of eternalism and presentism. It takes from eternalism that the idea that past and present facts are real, and there is a block of real events or facts. But the growing block view says that future facts are not real yet. So there is, again, an objective and progressing present. And the idea is as this present progresses, more and more facts become real. They come into existence and are added to the block of past and present facts, and that block is growing. So the entirety of existence, as it were, grows as time progresses. So again, there is a fact now where you listen to this talk that is added to the block that wasn't part of the block 20 minutes ago. And there is a past fact where the Titanic is sinking, but it is not now the fact that Boris Johnson resigns or fails to be re-elected in the future. So we'll see, again, we'll see below whether that means that the future in such a view is open or not. One more boring definition before we finally get to the argument, just to make clear what I'm talking about when I'm saying determinism. Taking very broad definition here, nothing too technical. So let's say that determinism is the thesis that the complete state of the universe at any time, together with the laws of nature, uniquely fix the state of the universe at any later time. Right? And again, this appears to entail that if determinism is true, then there are no real alternatives, because the laws and the state of the universe uniquely fix one possible future. And again, that's traditionally how the debate has been framed, right? So determinism, because it excludes alternatives or seems to exclude alternatives, is seen to be incompatible with libertarian freedom, because it then rules out the power to do otherwise, and ultimate control if both of these notions require alternative possibilities, because you either want to set what you're going to do in the future, whether you order ice cream or mousse au chocolat for dessert, for example, and because it rules out that you set your reasons, because you can only have one set of reasons to act. Right. So I'll now go on, now that we've set the stage with all these lovely definitions, I will go on to argue that the truth of determinism alone is neither necessary nor sufficient for there not being real alternatives. What we'll see is that whether the future is open depends on your personal temporal ontology as well as on determinism and your view of laws of nature and properties. In a sense, they are even more fundamental than whether determinism is true or not. And so what that means is that determinism alone in isolation does not necessarily rule out a suitably robust sense of the power to do otherwise and of ultimate control. That means that determinism could be made compatible with a more robust notion of freedom, and that's what I'm trying to be arguing for at the end. Just as a brief hint of how this is going, to say that determinism is necessary for the lack of alternatives. So in some temporal ontologies, we will see in a bit, these temporal ontologies rule out alternative possibilities, future possibilities, regardless of whether determinism is the case or not. And it's not sufficient for the lack of alternatives, because in some temporal ontologies, you could have an open future even if some notion of determinism is true. Right, let's talk about the first option first, because that's very straightforward, that determinism is necessary for there not being any alternative possibilities. And that is, you have in some, like I said earlier, in some temporal ontologies and some views of laws, then future facts are settled even if determinism is false. And for example, you have static eternalism or dynamic eternalism. In both these views, the future facts are already timelessly settled, right? There's no change in the block of facts, past, present, and future. So there are no real alternatives at any time, because the future is already timelessly the case. It might be epistemically inaccessible, but that doesn't mean that it's not ontologically fixed. You might now ask, well, does that not just trivially imply determinism? Is that not just determinism? So why am I trying to tell you that determinism is not necessary for there not being any future alternatives? And I would say there's still a sense in which we might distinguish between determinism and indeterminism, even in such a temporal ontology where the future is already timelessly fixed. And the reason for that is because the laws might still be non-strict. So there might still be laws which, together with the state of the universe at any time t, if you take one time in the block of eternal facts, past, present, and future, do not uniquely fix or imply the state of the universe at any later time. So for example, take any Lewisian best system view with non-strict laws, in which you could say that the laws are the theorems of a deductively closed system that strikes the best balance between simplicity and strength. And now some of these theorems might turn out to be probabilistic, like, for example, stating the chance of decay in radioactive isotopes. So in Human Supervenience Debugged, Lewis debated such a possibility. So even although the laws are still nothing over and above patterns in this block of eternal block of facts, there might be laws that are probabilistic. Still, even although we have these probabilistic laws in a world which has a fixed future, we could still say that in some sense this world is indeterministic, because it has indeterministic or probabilistic laws. Now we have the second alternative, saying that determinism is not sufficient for any lack of alternatives, and that is a lot less straightforward than the other way around. What this means is that whether determinism is sufficient for the lack of real alternatives then depends on, for one, the temporal ontology that we have at hand, and the exact definition of determinism. So let's go through two accounts. Two are fairly straightforward, and there are more that are possible, and one that is a bit less straightforward. So, for example, again, take determinism in eternalist views. The future is, in such a view, both fixed in the sense that there is only one possible state of events, So the future is fixed by the fact that the future is timelessly fixed, and by the fact that the laws and the state of the universe entail any later state of the universe. In a sense, it's overdetermined. Then you have a second possibility here, in which we could, for example, combine necessitarianism and certain dynamic temporal ontologies. So you could combine a growing block view, for example, with a necessitarian view of laws or properties, and that is what Ray Briggs and Graham Forbes have done in 2017. So they said that if you combine such a view of time with a necessitarian view of laws and properties, it would be the case that facts that are the case now restrict the range of possibilities for the future. So, for example, if it is a fact now that necessarily ferromagnets attract iron, then this restricts future alternatives to those in which ferromagnets indeed do attract iron. And if such a world would be deterministic, then this would again imply the absence of real alternatives, right? Because the deterministic laws and the state of the world together uniquely imply one single possible future. So again, in this world, you have no real alternatives, although the temporal ontology alone would allow for an open future. And again, something similar could be constructed for presentism. So you could say, so far so good. What have I shown you here? We have two scenarios in which determinism indeed does determine the absence of real alternatives, right? So what am I talking about? The problem now is that there are views in which the laws could be strict, temporal ontologies, I mean, in which the laws could be strict, but which do not uniquely fix one possible future. And we'll have to debate in a second whether we want to call such a view actually deterministic or not. So a slightly less straightforward situation than the two that I've just given you, in which determinism did indeed preclude possible alternative futures of events. So again, we could take a temporal ontology with an unreal future, for example, a growing block theory, right? And combine that this time not with a necessitarian view of laws like Briggs and Forbes did, but with a Humean view. And that's something that I explored a couple of years ago. Just as a reminder what Humeanism means, so let's take Humeanism as the view that there are no necessary connections in nature, no natural necessity, right? No umfing and biffing going on. And what unites all of these views in a modern way of phrasing things is Lewis's Humean supervenience thesis. So, for example, take his definition here. All there is to the world is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular facts, just one little thing after another. For short, we have an arrangement of qualities, and that is all. There is no difference without difference in the arrangement of qualities. All else supervenes on that. Let's ignore the locality condition there for a second, because that's false. In any Humean view, then, of course, if the laws are a thing, then they too need to supervene on the totality of the occurrent facts. And again, let's take a Lewisian best system view, which means that let's just take everything you know and systematize it into a deductively closed system. The laws then are the theorems of the deductively closed system that strikes the best balance between strength and simplicity. I mean, you probably all know that there's a bunch of problems connected with that view, but just run with it for a second. and then go on to combine this with a growing block view. So the growing block view now is special in the sense that the totality of your current facts on which all is supposed to supervene in a Humean view is, for one, growing, and second, excludes all future facts. And that leaves us with two options. The first option would be is that you still want to insist on the laws supervening on all facts, and that means even the ones that yet are to come about. And if that's the case, then you would have no laws until the end of time, right? Only at the end, if time runs out, right, if there is one, you get a complete Humean mosaic. But that that means that up until that time, you have no laws. And that seems unattractive, right? Because this would make a lot of what we want from laws unavailable, because we don't have the laws until time runs out and the Humean mosaic is complete. So we would have no way, for example, to distinguish between physically possible and impossible facts at any particular non-final time t, if physical possibility is logical consistency with the laws, because there aren't any laws yet before time runs out. And again, if scientific explanation has anything to do with the laws, we could at no non-final time offer any scientific explanation, again, because there are no laws. And also, it just seems a bit counterintuitive, right? That laws only just pop into existence at the end of time. I mean, we could also ask, what does end of time actually mean? Is there one? I mean, who knows? And if there is no end of time at which we will be presented with a nice and neat complete mosaic of past, present, and future facts, then there will never be any laws. So you could instead propose that the laws supervene on whatever facts are part of the Humean mosaic at the present, and not at the end of time. So that would give you at any time, because at any time t, you already have in the growing block view a block of past and present fact, right? And these this block of past and present facts can act as the supervenience base of the best system. And that would mean that the laws would indeed be temporally, well, they would be tensed, right? They would have a temporal operator. So you could say that if so far all phi's have been psi's and all other conditions of law are fulfilled, then we get a set of laws for any instant t of non-final instant t of the form historically all phi's have been psi's. And if you want to include the present, then you need to include the non-tensed regularity as well there. Now this has the consequence that the supervenience base for the laws is changing, right, from time to time, because it grows. Right? The block of past, present, and present facts, I mean, grows as time progresses. So you have more and possibly different facts at future times. That has the consequence that the laws might change, and not just in their supervenience base, but also in content, if other facts are added to the block. So regardless of whether you think the first or the second option are preferable, that either you wait for the end of time for your laws or you tense the laws as time goes on, the Humean laws could, again, in some sense, be deterministic. So, for example, take the first option. If the laws turn out to be strict at the end of time, then the state of the universe at any time in the block and the laws together uniquely imply the state of the universe at any later time in the block. That is quite close to our initial definition of determinism, right? If you take the second option and think that you should not wait until the end of time to get your laws, but you have a set of laws that supervene on a supervenience base of past and present facts at any particular present time, then you could, these laws again could be deterministic in the sense that the state of the universe at t, at any time t in the block, so any non-present time t, and the laws together uniquely imply the state of the universe at any later time until, after t up until the present, right? It doesn't say anything about the world after the present because those events or those facts aren't part of the supervenience space of the laws. So that's the crucial bit of information here. Regardless of what you think we should do with the laws in a growing block view, if you're a Humean, in both versions, at any present time, the past or the present states of the universe and the laws, even although the laws might be deterministic in a suitably robust sense, do not uniquely determine the state of the universe at any future time. Because either there aren't any laws yet, right? Or because the laws do not apply to the future, because the future facts are not part of the supervenience space. So in a sense, there we could have deterministic laws that do not at any present non-final time restrict the future alternatives. Now, at this stage, you might object two things. First of all, you might object that all of this sounds rather fanciful, right? Why should you combine a growing block view with Humeanism? And the point that I'm trying to make here is not to convince you of the fact that this is indeed what our world is. What I'm trying to convince you of is that if we cannot rule out these possibilities out of hand, we cannot say that determinism is the only factor that rules out future possibilities, right? And you might also object that this isn't really determinism anymore. If your definition of determinism does not fix the future, then you might object that we need a better definition of determinism because that's what I care about in determinism. But I would say that in both Humean growing block theory views that we've discussed so far, this intuition is very hard to cash in, right? Because in the case where we only get the laws at the end of time, then there simply are no laws which could in any way restrict the possibility range of the objectively future facts, right? So if you want your definition of determinism to do that, to restrict the possibility range of objectively future facts, you're out of luck, right? Because if you think that determinism has anything to do with the laws, right? If determinism has anything to do with the laws can't give you that in this sense. So if you have a problem with that notion of determinism, you must divorce your notion of determinism from your notion of the laws. And what about determinism in the tensed law view, right? Even there, we have the idea that if the laws are strict, then the laws in the state of the universe at any non-final time t entail the state of the universe of any later non-final and non-present time t, I should add. And you still could say that this is problematic because the laws still do not restrict future possibilities, and that's what you want determinism to offer you, right? And because the laws even could change as the block grows and the block changes. So you think, what good are the laws if they don't fix the future, if they don't offer you what you think deterministic laws should do? But I would say that if you have an issue with that, then that's just your anti-Humean intuitions showing. Regardless of what you think about time, the Humean laws don't fix anything anyway, right? They are ontologically second to what's happening. They don't make stuff happen in the world, regardless of whether you're an eternalist or not. So if that's your issue, that's not based on this weird combination of the growing block view and Humeanism. That's just a factor that is embedded in Humeanism, because laws in Humeanism don't do anything anyway, right? They might entail facts that are later in the block, but they don't fix anything. And the same is the case in Eternalism, right? Like I said, if that's what you have a problem with, then you can't think that determinism has anything to do with the laws in any eternalist Humean world either. And maybe that's your takeaway here. I mean, that's also an interesting result. And yet I would say in any Humean world, growing block view, eternalist, or maybe even presentist, if you can construct a presentist humanist view, I would say it still does make a fundamental difference whether the laws are strict or probabilistic. So it is still there is still a reason to talk about determinism or indeterminism in such a view, even though whether the future is open or not is fixed by other stuff than by the question whether determinism is the case or not. To the Humean, that's all there is to the issue whether determinism is the case. The only thing, that is actually that you can actually answer to the question of whether the world is deterministic or not is whether the laws are strict or not, and that's the same for eternalism. And again, if you have a problem with that notion of determinism, then no Humean view will ever do, open future, eternalist, or otherwise. So where does that leave us now? We've talked about this rather fanciful combination of growing block view and humanism, and that future possibilities might be ruled out by your temporal ontology, regardless of whether the laws are deterministic or not. So where does that leave us with freedom in mind, right? That's where we entered this whole debate, and where we did this, came to do this slightly boring terminological work that we've been doing for the last 40 minutes. Again, remember that views on freedom that require the power to do otherwise require real alternatives, right? And these are traditionally taken to be incompatible with determinism. And we've just seen that some temporal ontologies in which determinism, that there are temporal ontologies in which determinism can be false, but still there are no real alternatives, such as eternalism. And on the other hand, that there are temporal ontologies that have strict deterministic laws, but in which still you have no restriction of what future alternatives could be. So again, determinism alone does not determine whether there are real alternatives, and I argue that views on freedom should be categorized according to whether they are compatible with a fixed future, because that is what matters, and not just with determinism. So where do we go from there? So far, I've only talked about classification and terminology, and you might say that's a bit boring. What I came to hear about today in a talk that is called "Time for Freedom" is I want to know whether I can be free or not. Maybe even in these weird Humean worlds that we discussed earlier. So the remaining question is, how can I be free, or can I be free in any suitably robust sense, even in eternalism, for example, with this fixed future? So for the last 3 or 4 slides, I'm going to give you a very, very rough sketch of my position that I have on freedom. And that is basically boils down to that I think that it's not just whether, but how the future is fixed that matters for the question of whether you are free or not. I would say it makes a difference to the question how free an agent can be, whether the future is just timelessly the case, or whether the future is necessitated by the state of the universe and the laws. In any necessitarian or deterministic world, regardless of temporal ontology, right? If we just leave Briggs and Forbes for a second, your future actions are necessitated or compelled or necessarily brought about by the laws and any prior state of the universe. And this doesn't sit well with libertarian intuitions, right? So in such a world, you would not just have no power to do otherwise because there are no alternative possibilities, but you also would not have any ultimate control because the agent would not be the ultimate source of their actions, and their reasons to act would be necessitated, like compelled to be come about by the laws and the prior state of the universe. So in a necessitarian and deterministic world, you lack both criteria for libertarian freedom. But in a Humean world, regardless of your temporal ontology, right, regardless of whether you're an eternalist or whether you're an whether you're a presentist or growing block theorist, the laws, the only thing the laws actually do is they supervene on the occurrent facts. They're just summaries of what happens. And whatever you do, your actions are part of the supervenience base for the laws. So in that sense, the laws might entail your actions because they're summaries of everything that happens, including your actions, but your actions are ontologically prior to the laws. So in a sense, you do not do what you do because the laws are the way they are, but the laws are the way they are because partly you do what you do. And if you then have such a human world with an open future, for example, like the growing block view, then you even trivially have the power to do otherwise, as no future is ruled out, right? There's the laws and the state of the universe do not fix any future further development of the world. So trivially, there are alternatives. And similarly, we can have a similar argument for your reasons to act, right? So for ultimate control, they too, so the reasons to act are part of the supervenience base of the laws. They too are fixed by you and not by the universe, right? So that plays more into our notion of ultimate responsibility or ultimate control. So at this stage, you might be mightily angry and say, hold on a minute, that's not what I mean with libertarianism, doing otherwise or control. This is just fancy wordplay, right? And I would say, fine, if you have these intuitions, if you think that libertarianism must be something stronger than that, or doing otherwise must be something stronger than that, or control must be something stronger than that, fine. But the problem is, it's better what is possible in a necessitarian world, and it's all we can get, right? You could also say that's madness, right? The laws are unchangeable, and my actions certainly can't change what the laws are, right? I also want to make predictions based on strong and stable laws, right? I want to be able to project into the future. This doesn't seem to cash in any sort of intuitions that you might have about the laws. And I would say, again, fine, if that's what you think, but just be careful. This is where I shoehorn a bit of my work on induction in, is just be careful that necessary connections on their own do not prevent changing laws without further argument that necessary connections are timelessly unchangeable, right? You also have to argue that the necessary connections cannot change. And that's actually quite hard to argue for if you really take a look at this. So changing laws, you do not get rid of necessarily, at least not trivially, by adopting a necessitarian ontology. But even if the laws were unchangeable, that would still not make your predictions any more secure, right? Predictions are usually inductive inferences, and the problem is you cannot justify these or make them more secure by reference to necessary connections, because you know of the necessary connections by induction. So if you thought that this entire talk was this complete madness and me just piling one weird ontological possibility onto the next just in order to make my point, it's not quite as straightforward as you might think in necessitarian views as well. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks for your attention.